Dick and Fred, who is running these wonderful machines, and we'll sooner or later get them right. And our subject is the internet. And our agenda is as follows. I will open with a general picture of the potential of the internet. Next will be Jason, who has written a very interesting paper pointing to some problems in the internet today and in my theories. Fred is going to talk about Dyer's project in his book Cyber Marks, his project called Red 20, which shows how future world prosperity, where the economy is run democratically through the connectivity of the internet. And finally, we're expecting, he's on his way, Harry Halpin, who is from the very beginnings of the World Wide Web, one of the key players in the structure of the internet, and also looks at it from a point of view of revolution. And so all of these papers are online for those of you that want to read them. And I'll begin with mine. Okay, my presentation derives from my theory, which is called the modern Archimedes hypothesis. Now, everybody knows that Archimedes was a genius back in ancient Greece, actually in Sicily, who had a thought experiment. And the thought experiment went as follows. Give me a lever long enough, a fulcrum, and a place to stand, and I will lift the earth. Now, obviously, this was a thought experiment. There is no place in space where you could stand, nor a lever long enough. But, in fact, the theory was correct, and it, on the basis of it, all kinds of other inventions, from the inclined plane and the pulley and everything else, that has given us modern technology for better and for worse. And this theory occurred to me when, thanks to Alexei and Julia, I was sent to South Africa for a meeting of revolutionaries in the south part of the world who wanted to form not a new international party top down, the fourth or fifth or sixth, but a network. And this was in 1997, in the early days of internet connectivity. And after the Zapatistas had used it notably, and it was at the time of the Liverpool strikers and so on. And we were able to organize this conference in South Africa through the internet. And so I thought, what am I to present to this? And I thought, and I had a vision. And the vision was that it's a new ball game for us old internationalists, international revolutionaries. The people that invited me have been struggling in South Africa and spent time in Robben Island prison with Nelson Mandela as prisoners. But were not, as he was, subject to the Communist Party. They were true internationalists. So the two innovative things were the idea of a network rather than a top-down party. And the idea that it was vastly facilitated by the email and the beginnings of the internet at that time, so that international solidarity could be organized in real time. Inspiration, and it gave me hope to think that perhaps a emergence of a new world that was possible. Now, what I've done for this particular topic of our seminar is that instead of I put my papers in the Dropbox, but then I said, I've been talking to all of you. What we really need to do is transform our knowledge, transform our conclusions, transform our disagreements and our doubts as well into grist for the mill. That is to say, the goal of this project is a narrative that is plausible enough and based on reality, not on fantasy or gods or the stuff of comic books, that would allow people to imagine. Because if there's one chance in 100 to save this beautiful planet and all the beautiful people and animals and plants on it, if there's one chance in 100, we ought to be able to imagine, at least in broad general terms. So that's what we're here for, and we're going to have an exercise later in the session to see what we can do, just improvise. So as you listen and as you participate in this discussion, take notes or in the back of your mind if you have any inspirations of a scene that you can imagine that takes place in the future, either in the, and just categorize it. Is it something about how, or is it something about now? Because we're dividing our future or our narrative into three parts as we build it. We'll smooth it out. But now means 2007, 2117. Then is 2017, where we are now, and how is the most difficult part. How do we get from here to there? And that's where most utopias, good or bad ones, have fallen down, because they never tell you how to get to this wonderful, supposedly wonderful place. So let's start now. I'll try to summarize rapidly my report about the internet. I begin, and this is the consensus among historians today, and I'm writing in 2017, is that the internet played an essential part in the 21st century emergence of vast planetary movements strong enough to overthrow the dying capitalist world system. But for a long time, it was a contested arena and a two-edged sword. And then I go on to develop this. But the main points, even though it was contested, is that the internet was a powerful and increasingly accessible new tool for struggle, whose revolutionary potential was beginning to be seized upon by popular movements around the globe already towards the end of the 20th century. Two, the internet could make technically possible the internationalist dream of a global movement of working people uniting in real time to overthrow the bosses and establish a sustainable, self-governing, post-capitalist world. And three, the internet's web-like global network, whose center is everywhere and nowhere, was turning out to be a more effective model for the emergence of planetary, democratic, working class movements than traditional hub-and-spokes, center-periphery, top-down vertical models of centralized parties and internationalists directed from Moscow or New York or Paris. So what I'd like to do is just summarize some of these points as I develop them now on the wiki. And there, as an historian, I look back and show how networking was already, at the end of the 20th century, a new model in Latin America with horizontalism and so on. And then we talked about the network of networks in the period of anti-globalization. And that democracy, as we understand it, which was perhaps very big progress in the 18th century, has now become a representative democracy where people are really asked to choose between Joe Stink and Mo Stink, as my grandmother used to say, once every 4 or 5 years. Whereas what is needed is vital participatory democracy from the bottom up. And these ideas were already prefigured. They go back to the Paris Commune, they go back to the Soviets in Russia in 1917, they go back to the Hungarian Revolution with its workers' councils, and various theoreticians, including one that I mentioned, Castoriadis, who was my teacher in Paris in the late 50s, and whose little pamphlet, The Content of Socialism, showed that an economy could be organized from below, democratically, through councils and everything connected by internet. Now, the next point that I make, and again, I'm just going to summarize it, is the nature of the internet and its philosophy, if you will, okay? And this section is called Complexity, Connectivity, and Emergence, okay? Now, what's different about today is that we now know that everybody in the world is connected by 6 degrees of, what is that called, separation, okay? So that means that I know someone who knows someone who knows someone who knows someone who knows, let's say, Madame Hugh, a shoemaker in the Canton Sun, which is Madame John, okay? So the idea that these are weak connections, but it turns out that the internet and many other scientific and phenomena, including emergence, is based on weak connections. And that they, when they are in a web form and can interact, it turns out to be a very, very powerful force. And so the idea of connecting up the collective brain of humanity, which is what we need to do to save the world from the pseudo-rationality of the corporate profit system, which was, back 100 years ago, consuming the world like a cancer. It had long been recognized that the judgment of large numbers of randomly chosen people is often strikingly superior to that of experts. That's the famous wisdom of crowds, which we socialists always call wisdom is in the heads of many. Okay? So the collective brain of humanity, which Harry talks about in his paper and various other people, seemed that when I thought of it as a rather hairy kind of mystical sounding thing, but in fact, it turns out that rather than being unscientific and mystical, it is perfectly coherent and congruent with modern science, not the Newtonian physics and the Cartesian dualism and what most people, especially the Stalinists on the one hand, and the old-fashioned, what we call, I'm thinking in French, we call them scientistes, which means people who, what is the word I'm looking for? The people who believe in progress, okay?
Positivists.
What?
Positivists.
Positivists, thank you, okay. Rather, that's all old stuff. That's all old stuff from the 18th and 19th century. Today, we talk about complexity and emergence, and it's not, we can take as an example, the development of the human brain in a baby. The time that the baby is born, with a brain that is not connected internally. It's constantly generating new circuits inside the brain. The brain develops, and it develops not like in a teleological way, on a pattern that's imposed, but in the interaction with the parent and with the world around it. And there are many very easy to understand examples of this kind of emergence. Take birds that fly. A flock of ducks that's right now flying down to Florida. They somehow always know where to go. They come back every year to the same place. I had them on my pond once when I lived in the country. And they have a collective wisdom and a kind of cooperation where one bird is in the front, opening, breaking the air and making it easier. And then that bird moves to the back and somebody else moves up. There are many, many other examples. In Asia, there are insects that suddenly and simultaneously burst into chirping and flashing. Well, the scientists worked on that problem for years. And what was the problem? They were looking for the leader, but there is no leader. There is no leader. Revolutionaries called this spontaneity, and that's very, very good. Rosa Luxemburg and others talked about it in 1905. But a better name for it is self-organization. So I developed this point, and many is different in the world of complexity. So that many, many things combine. And we're hoping that a kind of synergy, social movements, the hooking, the wiring up together of the collective brain of humanity and such will help us overcome capitalism. At least we can imagine it, okay? Now, the next part of my talk, excuse me, I should say that I'm going to put my future historian hat on and talk about the past, because we are now in 2117. So looking backward, we can see that in the 18th century, the development of printing and also of the post office made the American and French revolutions possible, because the people in Virginia could communicate with the people in Boston, the people in Bordeaux with the people in Paris. They could watch out for spies and enemies. They could write pamphlets and distribute them. And something like Tom Paine's pamphlets were read by practically everybody. Okay? Moving forward to the first international revolutions of 1848, it was the telegraph that enabled people in Vienna to know practically in real time what was going on the barricades of Paris. And when we moved into the 20th century, we got a negative phenomenon in communications technology that was top-down broadcasting, where the monopoly of the voice beaming down on the people was exploited by people like Stalin and Hitler, Mussolini, but also by Roosevelt and Churchill, fireside chats and radio broadcasts and so on. And then in the post-war period, taken over by the capitalists themselves, who had only one message: buy and conform. So we can see that the structure of technologies, both in their essence and the way they're socially organized, is very, very important in the development of democratic revolutions. By the end of the 20th century, as we mentioned, networking and the internet began to dominate in the protests around the world, of course, and culminating in 2011 with the Arab Spring, which had reverberations in Greece and all over Europe, and in Wisconsin, and finally with Occupy Wall Street in the US. And although it didn't take power, and it wasn't fully global, it certainly changed the political conversation in the United States. The idea of this is what democracy looks like, and the idea of the 1% and the 99% is ineradicable from people's minds. Just as in Egypt, the idea that people could overthrow a government, they're not going to forget that. Now, the next part that the future historian looks at was all of the negative problems that we had with the internet in the early 21st century. It's commercialization. It's used for spying on people. It's used for gathering everybody's personal data. It's used for all kinds of criminal activities. the possibility of cyber war. And there are many other negative aspects that I go into, that as an historian, I note. And Jason is going to add to some of these things. What struck me preparing for this report is that much of what the problem is with social media is the structure. These platforms, which are governed by corporations and regulated by algorithms that have all kinds of negative effects, are inimical to, how do you say that? Never mind, they're bad. They're bad for the horizontal person-to-person communications. So the challenge that we have is to imagine other types of platforms, other types of social media that will be alternatives to the one that is being invaded. And Harry has given us a paper, Harry, who is at the center of the struggle, about the internet wars. Because right now, there's a big battle going on, and it's a very obscure one, because it takes place in all kinds of government, and UN, and other bodies that we can't really look at carefully, and it uses technical language like net neutrality. Some of us, at least, have finally understood what that is. But there's a lot more stuff that's going on there, and basically, what we have, as future historians, we need to record is how humans develop better technology, better platforms, algorithms that increase democracy, and we're able to defeat this aggressive onslaught, because ever and always the internet was a double-edged sword. So that's my summary of of what I've done, and you can see it all right now. Don't go to my old articles in the Dropbox. Go immediately to the new internet chapter of Then and Now, where I've modified and transformed things that I've been developing for 20 years now, this theory, into history. And to my own surprise, although I've been saying it since we've been meeting, it actually changed my viewpoint. Looking at it as something that happened, starting with the assumption that we did survive into 2117, just as Marx, when he read the Utopia of Socialism, said, well, socialism is possible. Now we have to work on how to get from here to there, which is something the utopians neglected. And I guarantee, I'm challenging everybody, that if you think from that point of view, and I think we should all wear hats when we come here, or at least for the second part of the meeting, if we put on our future historian hats, we see some things in a different way. So I'm asserting that our utopianism is entirely consistent with the Marxist method and with the visionaries of all the other branches of socialism, anarchists, syndicalists, the wobblies who look forward to one big union taking over all the different industries. And presumably, and it's our job to imagine it happened someplace between 2020 and 2050. So let's move on, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, the floor is open for discussion on Richard's presentation temporarily. But you want to go straight to Jason?
Which I think it would make sense, because he's reading his paper is in a sense a friendly, quite rigorous critique of what I just said.
So we'll go to Jason. Just
I think that's how I plan it. And then we'll open the discussion.
Then we'll open it. Cool.
would it be easy to show some photos, or we didn't plan this, sorry, but if it's not easy.
It's not too hard. What am I looking for?
If you go to twitter.com/redtrackworker.
Okay, give me a second.
Yeah. Sorry, I just want to quickly show some photos just to provide some context, might be. And then red track worker.
Red what?
Track.
Red.
TRACK worker.
Oh, that's you. Red
Yeah.
track worker. Yes. Yeah.
And then the second tweet, not the top one, but that one.
This one right here.
Yeah.
You want just the image?
Yeah, just click on it. And then this was yesterday, by the way. Can people see it on the?
No, they can't see it yet, but they will see it in a moment.
Okay. The infinity is pretty. Yeah, so if you just scroll through it, it's on like. And then, so what this was yesterday, there was a kind of a, I think it was relatively last minute, 2 or 3 week old call to have a Syrian day over age. And it, so this is an example of the power of the internet. This was organized, really could have only been organized in this fashion because of the internet, to get people out all over the world, different cities in Europe, in the US, I just know Chicago and New York, but also throughout Syria, like those pictures that are on the screen right now from inside Syria. And so, I mean, I started here just because, for one, a lot of people, even on the left, don't even know there are people in Syria that are still raising the original demands of the Arab Spring for freedom and justice against both the side, but also against the groups like aligned with Al-Qaeda and similar groups. So I mean, there's just a question there to dwell on is, like, given that we have the internet, leaving aside the question of what one could summarize tragically as the defeat of the Arab Spring, but that would be overly simplified. Like, why is the internet not at least facilitating the global left to, like, share pictures like this more widely? The other thing is, if you look at the pictures in Europe, that's in Syria right now. Like these, it's mainly Syrians and a handful of non-Syrians. There aren't any really identified left groups present. So there were, like, I mean, it was Marxists here, mostly independent, but some small groups in the US that implied the call in this country. So it's not a complete separation, that's inside Syria too. And so it's just become more and more clear that the connection I draw in my papers between the role of fake news in the election of Trump, but also the role of this kind of stuff in the left has not taken a consistent position in solidarity with the Syrian revolution in particular, but it's also undermined the more general solidarity. So, like, most leftists aren't talking about, there are being like dozens of arrests to hundreds every month in Egypt of left-wing activists, and people aren't talking about it anymore. In general, I mean, if you are, not to discount them. But so, Richard, getting on the point of the need for maybe a different platform than social media, or at least technology to augment social media to counteract some of these problems. Like, a lot of the left focuses on the problem of government surveillance and stuff like that, which is important, but what has happened with Syria and with Trump, I think, convinced me that the problem is much deeper in 2 ways. One, in terms of technologically, that social media as it exists enables the rise of disinformation, but also that it showed that groups, I'm using the left journalistically because what does left mean? But groups that at least claim to, like, stand for universal values and against oppression and for freedom, in general, failed to just show, like just share this information that I just showed you yesterday. I mean, yesterday's recent, but we can go back to whenever else you want to. And so it calls into question to me, like, what have we, like, the internet's clearly, if there isn't Richard's point about emergence and connectivity and not needing leaders, but that connection has to connect something that has some kind of core commitment to universal values. And this has shown, I think, the weakness of that commitment. Not necessarily on individuals who, because of the nature of this information sharing, they're just not exposed to it, perhaps. But on the question of, like, left institutions, publications, political parties, whatever you want to talk about. It's a test that shows that something was wrong, and that the internet itself clearly doesn't solve that problem because we have the internet. Just to say something about the fake news, because it's both kind of well known on the left, but also some people dismiss it as like the Democrats being afraid of Russia. The morning after the Las Vegas shooting, one of my coworkers came into work and was like, "Oh, I heard he was targeting Trump supporters because it was a country music concert." But this was it was a concerted effort, perhaps. I don't know. It's not known yet who was behind it. It might have been just spontaneous in a sense, but one of the ways to keep people wedded to supporting Trump, despite all his failures, is to make them fear that they're targeted by the Democratic Party or leftists or whatever. And this is crazy too, because some people think it's a problem just isolated people in rural areas or something, but this is a worker in New York City in a union that knows me personally, and yet he's, one foot in, 1 foot out. Sometimes he wants to kill me, and sometimes he's listening to what I'm trying to explain to him. And the social media is actually worsening this problem in terms of exposing isolated people to this kind of targeted propaganda campaigns. I think I'm gonna leave it there for discussion, but I guess the two notes I want to sound are thinking through what can we do something technologically to address it, but this problem of a failure of what I'm calling universal values, but people have a different framework they want to propose, or how do technology doesn't solve that problem. How do we address that problem? But I'd like questions. I know I skipped around and didn't go into detail on a lot of it, but I just want to kind of summarize the paper and then, discussion and questions.
Frank, do you want to go next and say a few words about Dyer's paper on red plenty?
Well,
we're moving into the future.
I think that there are a bunch of issues on the table right now that may get lost if we don't. I would suggest instead that we do a discussion of the questions that Jason has raised in relation to Richard's original presentation. And I think Harry has just arrived, who may have some thoughts on that as well. Because I think the Dyer-Weatherford thing is quite interesting and useful for us, but I think it is a little removed from the immediate questions that Jason in particular has put on the table. So I suggest we proceed that way instead. And not to put Harry on the spot since he just walked into the room, but I think he's probably already familiar with Jason's paper.
Yeah. So
and would like to maybe introduce yourself and then give us your thoughts.
Yeah, so I'm Harry Halpin. I work at Indria in France. I visited New York, unfortunately not very long. And I used to work at MIT on cryptography, web standards, HTML, these sort of things. Now I think there's a lot of questions around right now that this cycle onto three interrelated themes of surveillance, of artificial intelligence, and fake news. And I'm going to make a little bit of brief commentary on fake news, and then a little brief more questions for David and everyone. I think, Jason in particular, I think he's very brilliant, and he wrote the right questions. So I think the internet historically has been viewed very positively as a potential tool for liberation. And it was viewed as a tool for liberation because it had a certain peer-to-peer architecture. Anyone could send messages to anyone. And that seems somehow naturally anti-authoritarian, possibly useful for workers' councils and whatever, in comparison to the previous media structures, radio, television, which were seemed more authoritarian in analogy because of their one-to-many broadcasting structure. It seemed more hierarchical. So I think there is, and so everyone from Richard to Hardin Negri to Yochai Winkler, there's a lot, and Nick Dyer-Weatherford, there's a lot of discussion over the liberatory uses of technology. But what we've seen in the last year or two, particularly since the Trump election, is this concern over fake news and dark uses of the internet by nation-state actors to repress and destroy dissent. And this is both the surveillance, people such as Snowden, we were always very concerned over the use of surveillance to track down and kill activists. So I was in Syria, I was friends with Basil Bartabi. I worked on preparing citizen journalists, part of the social movements, who often are Syrian but living overseas in Paris to go to Syria. And we had a lot of encryption in order to defend them if their computer was seized. But and the Syrian activists, such as Basil, noticed one thing very quickly on, which is they couldn't trust the telephone lines in Syria. Because the telephone lines are controlled by Assad completely. So they said, we need somebody to communicate. At this point, applications such as Signal or Briar didn't exist. We didn't have any good communication applications. I don't know what all us programmers were doing, but we weren't working on that. And so a lot of the Syrian actors use Skype. And at a certain, and Basil was very interested, well, look, if the Syrian revolution is going to succeed, we need a communication infrastructure we can trust. And now what happened, it's unclear exactly what happened. That, you know, despite the fact that it did not seem the beginning of the revolution, that these various little groups of different towns, because the Syrian revolution didn't come from Damascus, right? It came from, you know, Damaa, little towns, basically, kind of viewed as marginal. There was, you know, groups forming. All people didn't know each other. The political dialogue was somewhat illegal, but they met. It was on YouTube activism. They met. They had kind of private Skype chat. Ugarit, I think, is one of the larger ones. What happened, to my understanding, is two things. One, as the Syrian regime waited, let people communicate, then arrested people who they considered leaders, would ask them, open your Facebook, open your contacts, got contact groups, and use those to identify other people. Often it was not, I think, cyber surveillance, it was actually very physical surveillance, seizing of devices and forcing activists to reveal their contacts after threats of physical harm. So this is called the rubber hose technique. So you threaten to beat you with a rubber hose, no matter how much encryption or great software you have, they probably hand over what we want from you. The second thing we heard was that Iraqi Skype is an American company. It's owned by Microsoft. Microsoft cooperates very heavily with the United States government. The United States government was concerned with jihadis using Skype, so they had given backdoor access to the Iraqi government. And what we heard rumor of from Basil, was never confirmed, is that there's concern that the Iraqi government handed a backdoor into Assad. Because in the beginning of the Syrian revolution, the US government wasn't really supportive. No one really knew what was going on, and it was just another revolt, okay? And Assad was actually viewed as maybe not the best, but an ally of the United States. And that this technology has been used to sort of mass identify people. Regardless, everyone was arrested, and over time, tortured and killed. The Syrian Democratic Social Movement was, I mean, I think I'm not sure what its status is now, I don't know, but I think it's mostly destroyed. So at some level, you have a question of technology, surveillance that used to distort movements in a very physical way. But one of the more interesting questions that Jason brought up, which I would love to know more, because I wasn't denying it happening, was not just the physical warfare, but the psychological side of warfare. So everyone's very concerned about Trump and fake news. My parents were Trump supporters. I can tell you why. Because they were a military family, they were traumatized by the Vietnam War, and that they believed, after the mainstream media lied to American people over Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction, that the media was untrustworthy. They voted for Trump because Trump was the only candidate. Basically said, you know, no more wars. The inside Iraq war. So I think a lot of the fake news media comes from this moment in Iraq. But regardless, it's been weaponized and used by Putin, by Russia, by generals, by the US intelligence agencies, by Syrian intelligence agencies. I don't think we have a good analysis of think, like, I feel confidence in technology. So can you design a version of Skype, which is harder for Assad to infiltrate, which is harder for the NSA to understand who's talking to you? I feel very confident I could design such technology. I think we know how. What we don't know how is we don't know how to make people resistant to essentially old-fashioned government propaganda spread through social media. My feeling is, I'm going to say one thing, I want to hear more commentary. I want to hear a bit more commentary. Because I want to hear, I think the main reason is a lack of solid political grounding by American activists. So,
Sorry, say that again?
solid grounding, political grounding. So when you see a directly democratic movement happen, such as Syria, I think someone who has clear politics would say, well, we always want to support grassroots movements by the people for a day-to-day democracy. Even if they're going to be confused, they know exactly what we want, we don't know them personally, it's generally the right thing to do. Now, I'm not sure, I don't know why, I guess it's some old-fashioned anti-imperialism, why there's so much support of Assad by the left in the United States. Why, and what we can do to clarify things. So my theory is that there's some questions we can solve technically. We can solve questions technically, such as questions about preventing surveillance. And there's some questions we can solve politically. Questions we can solve politically involve having better analysis, better theory, also just better instincts when dealing with the history of political movements. And I think that's more of an educational problem. And I think we can build tools that help identify propaganda. Okay, well, this story is probably fake. The Google's have not worked in this direction. You point someone out. I don't know. People just say, why should we trust these tools? Why should we trust Google? Google's part of the liberal conspiracy, which they are, right? They're part of the neoliberal conspiracy. So why should we trust Google? Why should we just Google more than CNN, more than some random guy on a possibly fake news website, or an American fake news website? But I think the reason why a lot of people are sympathetic to Trump and propaganda from Russia, to some extent, Russian intelligence agencies, is because they correctly identify that the U.S. news is heavily corporate controlled, heavily biased against working class interests, against their interests. But we don't have a good alternative. We did make it the media that's not the case. I don't know what to do. So I'd like to just hear people riff on that.
You want to put it out to the larger community here?
Yeah.
The floor is open. Any thoughts?
You're all muted.
Unmute your mics and speak.
I'd like to hear from the Moscow branch on this question of, I'd like to hear from the Moscow branch on this question of the political vacuum on the left that allows all kinds of people to imagine that their job as leftists is not to be in solidarity with oppressed people trying to be free, but to take sides between one dictator and another, between Putin and Assad on the one hand, and Trump and the Saudi kings on the other.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard, for your very interesting about the internet as a powerful tool for social change and building a classless society. But I see here some problems concerning the present day situation in the world and people access to internet. Not mention that, but in the world, less population has an access to internet. It's only about 49 according to statistics. So the population does not have an access, and more of economic and technical backwardness, of poverty, and that's mainly not developed part of the world, like Asia and some parts of Asia and Africa. And so in order to realize all of internet, the economic development and progress is needed. But the most important thing is that even in those parts of the world where we have technical and economic possibilities for a general access to internet, obstacles with using it. And these obstacles are caused by government policies. According to the international ratings, there are about 20 countries in the world without free internet. And not only it's North Korea or China with the so-called Great Chinese Firewall, but also Russia is in this among these 20 countries. And of course, it's understandable that authoritarian governments, they are interested in blocking citizens' access to alternative information. They want, for instance, in Russia, to keep people influenced by the state-run television. Richard said that this vertical type of communication belonged to the past, but in Russia, it's the reality of present. Have dose of crude propaganda. Great Russia is encircled by enemies and blah, 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 blah. And this is very influential. And only a minority of people get information from alternative sources like internet. On one hand, in Russia, we have about 70% of population internet from time to time. But on the other hand, only about 50% of population are closely and more intensively today. So the government block access to some parts of internet. And according to statistics in Russia, today, the Russian government prohibited and closed about 90,000 websites. People can't use them. It's not yet Chinese firewall, but it's a development in this direction. There are such technologies as spying over people using the internet. There are various technologies, including antiviruses and so on. There are punishment of people who are unwanted informational networks. People who are behind the bars because they wrote in the internet on social networks so great, and Orthodox Church is not so great. And also the government is very frightened by people who organize them from below, people who want to use internet as this tool for political change, especially after the experience of the great popular mobilizations in Russia in 2011, 2012. And after that, the government decided to under its control. More maybe to sever all ties of Russian internet with international net. Just understand this situation and think how can we influence that. how can we prevent that? Question, which was here, is the so-called counter-revolutionary use of internet, also by government and pro-government forces. In Russia, we call it internet trolls. There is the government office, the so-called trolls factory in St. Petersburg, where hundreds of people work and receive money from government to make a propaganda in the internet and to attack various oppositional forces and groups and to destroy so-called unwanted sites. This must be resisted. And the freedom of internet should develop and should be protected. That's a question. Of course, there are a system of anonymizers, like Tor, for example, but technical possibilities on the government side to block Tor, access to Tor. Independent network of computer specialists can may develop some technical alternative network, for instance, using in the system, in order to provide people in not to access of internet. Have some idea, I would like and would be happy to hear about it. Thank
you.
Take the mic.
Alexei, quickly, I'd like to ask you two very specific questions about your organization Praxis, which does take political positions, quite radical ones, over the years. Praxis has a website. I'm not sure how it's working, and I know that you've been very active on Facebook up to now, and I wonder how directly this has affected you. How many people are in your Facebook? You know, click on it, and so on.
There's a lot of latency between here and Moscow.
He's muted to his duty.
He needs to unmute.
Oh,
There we go.
Boost the connection.
Alexei, it appears to be
Okay.
speaking.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Here we go.
Hear now.
Yes.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear us?
You can hear me.
Yes. 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 Yes.
Say yes, one more time.
Right. Yes, right now we have some technical difficulties with our website. I can't tell you exactly what kind of difficulties. This is very, in fact, that provider explains that there are technical problems, but what kind of problems, it's not clear. So, hand, there are difficulties with posting materials on the site because of the legislation of the so-called anti-extremism in Russia. And you have anti-extremist laws, but you don't have definition of what extremism is. For instance, some judges, they treat extremism as in which excite social and political hatred. So if you, for example, criticize government, criticize police, used in inciting hatred against social group, policemen, government officials, prison for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So people must think very carefully about what they post. So it's a kind of censorship now. It also affects internet. big risk to have a direct political agitation through networks. So this all makes people who are politically and socially active go to libraries and to study books from the early 20th century about conspiratorial techniques and so on. Must be, of course, adapted to the present day technologies and conditions.
Ask you about Facebook. Alexei, I also wanted to know about Praxis' presence on Facebook.
Yeah, we have both an official page of Praxis and a group of Praxis which is linked to the page, and also, of course, personal accounts which we can use. So if people are interested, please go to Facebook and join our group and our page. Official. And also we have some resources which are linked to our main website, like some resources devoted to Victor search, and you can find the links to these resources in our Facebook and the page.
Just a follow-up question. Our association with some groups might not know goes back to the 90s, and together we worked to establish both a library of independent socialists, anarchists, feminists, and other works in Russia that no one had been allowed to read for 70 years, left communists and others, and Praxis as a publishing house, with Julia as a translator and others, bringing not only the works of Victor Serge and Stalin the Socialist, but many, many others. And so basically we've been tied to libraries and print, and we've experienced the same kind of repression. It's shut down our libraries and so on. For the moment, we seem to be okay on that score. But getting back to Facebook, I just wondered if how many people are you in contact with through Facebook, and what are some of the issues that get discussed?
Richard, I can't hear you.
He asked, how many people do you have, are you in contact with on Facebook? And is
how many contacts
people on Facebook?
No, in our Facebook group, yeah. There are more than 300 contacts. Also on the page, our page has 400 with something subscribers.
What are the issues?
And what are they discussing? Is it in terms of content? What are the subjects?
Mostly problems of history, temporary situation with the left, internationally and in Russia. So all topics which reflect our conception and our tasks as a Center for Research and Education. But you see that the most present day political issues, participating in protests and so on, it is not so easy to discuss even on Facebook, to discuss personally.
Do you have discussions over Syria on Facebook? And what is
yes. There was a discussion about Syria, but you see, we don't have big things to discuss because people understand very well what is happening there. There are no differences in opinion about that.
What is it?
We are sure that both for us.
Yeah, so everyone in Russia recognizes the danger of the Assad regime. They recognize state propaganda as well.
Yeah, no, not everybody in Russia, but I mean in our circle. But many people in Russia, as I said, get information from the state-run television and radio, to use internet on a daily basis for various reasons. Still don't have a hot water and canalization. Internet.
So I would like to make one point, really quickly. And I think maybe we should move on. But I think the problem with a lot of people's radical analysis of the internet is that they believe the internet will be a solution to political problems. Mm-hmm. And I think the internet has more affordances, more possibilities for radical communist politics, radical socialist politics of some sort than previous forms of technology. But that does not mean that there is a technical determinism that will guarantee that these potentials, these utopian potentials, become true. And that the best way to view the internet is that while it has a lot of potential, just like Marx recognized the factory had lots of potential, it is still ultimately a technology created under capitalism. In order to realize its potential, there has to be a struggle. And therefore, the internet should be viewed just as we have ecology and neighborhood struggles and all these other things, as a terrain of struggle, as a place where struggle takes place, both technically and politically, and in terms of information warfare.
Raise a question related to that?
Barry, take it away.
Barry or Brian?
Brian,
Brian had the question.
Yeah, okay,
Brian.
so this resonates very strongly with a concept Murray Bookchin raised many decades ago about the social matrix of technology. The ways in which technologies, and I've got a pretty bad cold, so the cold I had last week has gotten worse instead of better. So the internal structures of technologies reflect and are a product of and also help shape the society that those technologies emerge from. So we see the commercialization of the internet, we see uses of the internet as a surveillance platform, we see the increasing dominance of 4 or 5 companies over the internet to some extent as a reflection of the ways in which the shaping of the technology under capitalism has facilitated various paths, various evolutionary paths in lieu of others. Given that, and given that that's where we are right now, I'm really curious to hear what avenues exist to potentially transcend that. We know about Tor and various platforms that exist to circumvent some of the surveillance aspects. We know about non-tracking browsers and what have you. But is there a potential at the current level of technology for evolving to a qualitatively different place that gives us more hope that kind of the internet idealism that existed in the early years, 20 years ago, can actually reemerge?
I'm going to just say two quick things. One is one of the problems of the internet that is not focused on very much by people working in privacy and surveillance is how to foster these small group discussions, how to make them better, how to discover truth, how to organize discussions in a productive way. So you see, we're forced to use Google products that maybe aren't so good. Chat, video, it's nice, but it's not really, it's no good note-taking, no good fact-checking, it's difficult. Now, some anarchist projects have started building software like this. The most popular being used by about 50,000 activists is very old software called Crabgrass, or Rise, so let's just establish private wikis, private wiki discussion groups. Whale Goning, who is famous for being Google employee involved in the Egyptian Revolution, has a startup. He's not an anti-capitalist officer, but it's a startup focused on this issue called Parleo. And there's some work on this. I think it's still a lot of technical work to be done on how to make groups, small groups in particular, organized and productive. And if you want these small groups to be workers' councils, to control production and consumption and distribution of goods, you definitely need a lot more engineering. Capitalism, because capitalism is been focused on individuals and advertising, tends to de-emphasize these kinds of projects. It makes it harder for these kinds of projects to get funding. Actually, the reason I'm in New York is because we found people who are kind of left-wing Silicon Valley people who are freaked out by Trump, who are looking to fund these kinds of projects. The second thing, which I would like to point out, is the internet itself somehow needs to become qualitatively different. And I would say a lot of the work around peer-to-peer work, particularly BitTorrent, to kind of think leverage share files, people are very into it, seems to be in a state of decline, but it was viewed as a possible new kind of internet. The other technology is Wikipedia, very open and shared knowledge. But when you look at Wikipedia, it's very interesting. Wikipedia isn't controlled by lots of little people chipping in. What you have is you have small groups that are very committed to Wikipedia, working on it all the time. And so I think if you look at technology in general, you're seeing that it's not that you just give everyone peer-to-peer software or everyone access to the internet and then somehow magic happens. Is that you still need networks of small groups that are politically or financially under capitalism motivated to succeed. And that's what really drove Wikipedia, that's what drove BitTorrent. And now we're seeing, really interestingly, a lot of focus on what's called Bitcoin and Ethereum. So there's lots and lots, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of young people who believe the current internet is broken and needs to be qualitatively transformed to become more trustworthy, more secure, and more decentralized. Now the problem is that most of these young people are not coming from a place with very good politics. They're either coming from people who don't know anything about politics, which is the majority of them, or they're coming from market libertarians, anarchist capitalists. Nonetheless, they have been fairly successful. They've created, Bitcoin is now worth more than JP Morgan, I think. So in terms of like the actual amount of money in it. So they're having some success. I think that rather, a lot of my friends had an argument about someone last night. They said, look, these people, libertarians, we should not associate with them. And I said, well, look, most of them are very young. They're in their 20s. They understandably don't have much exposure to demonstrations or politics or unions. So it's better to engage them because most of them are very angry about central banks. But they don't have a good analysis of all of capitalism, much of history, because it's not taught in schools. It's hard to find. And if your friends aren't talking about it, you're not going to talk about it. But they know, because of the 2008 crisis, that the banking sector is a source of corruption. So they're just trying to solve that problem rather than the sort of wider social problem. But I suspect, given the amount of energy and now, crazily enough, funding in that community, that we can help politically educate people to just become more revolutionary. And I think they would be very open. We had a discussion, added it to the reading list, one of the first Bitcoin coders went to Syria and fought with YPG and Rojava because he viewed it as they were trying to create a decentralized society. When he came back, he was very interested. He stayed at my house and he wanted to read Bookchin. He wanted to read Marx. Luckily, I had copies. But you know, but a lot of times there's going to be a lot more people like that. We can't just be like angry at them because they don't have the same background. It's understandable.
Nice. This is one last thing. So, what I'm taking from both Jason's report and Alexi's remarks is the following question. We've got a political question of political culture, which people like Alexi and many of us have been working on for a long, long time. Basically trying to get the zombie Stalinists from monopolizing the political discourse and projecting much saner and older view of what socialism is, which is about solidarity between workers, solidarity with women's struggles, solidarity with struggles, and not taking sides in an ongoing Cold War, which has now become a proxy war of many conflicting states. So that's one problem. And then the problem of the internet and how this can both help us be heard and at the same time make a milieu in which the totalitarian voices, if you want to call them that, also predominate. I think we need to keep both of those things in mind at the same time. And what I wanted to see Harry react to at some future point is how people like us who are concerned with this issue and who do come from a serious, I don't want to call it left, serious socialist and internationalist culture, how we can get our ideas across to them and engage in dialogue. Because even though this is a vast and ambitious project, we need to start small. As we started in Russia, when finally we were able to publish books by people like Victor Serge and the anarchists in Russia. It is education, and that's very, very important. So now, does anyone else want to? Okay, we're going to go to the next presentation.
Before that.
Oh, there it is.
Before that, just quickly, Barry, whose microphone is having problems on his end, but he posed a question in the chat, I think, for Harry, about blockchain, cryptocurrencies, and smart contracts. He says the mention of Bitcoin was addressed only in today's context and not the possible potential of these technologies for the future. So maybe just a quick response, and then maybe a suggestion of something we can read that will guide us.
I can force them to this.
Yeah.
So again, so by blockchain and smart contracts, it's generally talking about sort of next generation Bitcoin technology such as Ethereum. Ethereum is currently used today mostly to fund companies, crowdfunding. But the vision of Ethereum is that we replace lots of institutions, governments, and also get rid of middlemen in general, will be what's called a smart contract. So smart contract is sort of saying it's code, like a program, which if you do something is guaranteed to execute, and everyone can check without a middle person if you did it correctly. So the view would be, how do you prevent, for example, some government stealing money, a big problem in the world, or a corporation from, you sign a contract with a company and they just take your money and they don't give you the service that you want. You pay for it. I pay for something for Amazon, but you never ship it. And that the way that they imagine solving these problems, or what's called smart contracts, where there's code which shows if something's happened or not, and if it's happened, then everyone on this thing called blockchain, which is just really just a cryptographically audible ledger. It's like a distributed ledger. Like everyone has a copy of all the transactions that everyone else has. People can check. So there's no central body, such as a government or a state or a corporation, controlling this blockchain, this ledger of activity. And I honestly think that this technology has a lot of potential for, so I think there's two things going on. The first thing is that in terms of institutions, in terms of governance, the old saying is that we need transparency for the powerful. So in terms of getting rid of institutions, making them more decentralized, more people-centric, allowing people to communicate directly, but not pretending that people will always be angels, but recognizing that people can mistreat each other and not live up to their promises. Having a decentralized record bookkeeping system is actually probably very useful to future forms of revolutionary politics. So the blockchain, I think, will be useful. And we've already seen interest in technology in Rojava and other places. Now, the dark side of this technology is that you don't want to be in a situation where you're controlled by a computer program. So you can't go on a rent strike because your rents are automatically extracted by a computer program. And so I think the way you view things, again, it's political. You say, well, we want to replace powerful and corrupt institutions with better kinds of technology, but we don't want to force this technology on individuals. Transparency for the powerful, but privacy for the weak. Privacy for the majority of the population. And not everything should be put on a blockchain. There are lots of transactions, lots of relationships I have, which I want to be private. I have the right for these to be private, and that this privacy guarantees the ability to even have political dissent. So if political dissent requires privacy, then you don't want everything to go. So again, it's a political question rather than a technical question.
Just get the stand.
Oh, sure. Turn the camera off for that?
No, I'm fine.
Oh, okay.
Okay, we have switched cameras, so I can make a little presentation here on just a moment. Having mic challenge.
In, down, lower into the end. Yeah.
It's just 1 sec. Okay, good. So just a quick comment on some of the things Harry was just talking about. It just recalls to mind the fact that the Bolsheviks, after seizing power in Russia, published all the secret treaties that the Tsarist regime had made with the other imperialist powers, and that this was a powerful impetus to radicalization in many parts of the world. So just shifting gears a little bit here, we wanted to take a look at the Red Plenty article by, actually it's a review of a novel called Red Plenty by, the review is written by Nick Dyer-Witheford, who has also written a very interesting book called Cyber Marx. And I put several chapters of Cyber Marx in the Dropbox for this session. And in particular, chapter 8 of Cyber Marx elaborates on, or maybe forms the groundwork for some of the things that Dyer-Witheford is talking about in this review. So the book Red Plenty, the novel was an account of an effort by, a fictional effort, but drawing on some realities, an effort by Soviet computer scientists in the 1960s to establish a fully computerized system of economic planning. And it was published, the book was published right after the 2008 Wall Street meltdown, both as perhaps a cautionary tale on the part of pro-capitalist forces to say that there is no alternative, that economic planning is, by its nature, prone to failure. But it could also be read as, Dyer Witheford says, as a recollection of unrealized potentialities. So he's going to take the novel. Spufford is the author of the novel. Take Spufford's novel as a starting point from which to embark on an examination of the computing platforms that would be necessary for a contemporary Red Plenty, or for us, the computing platforms that might have been brought into existence by 2117, that as future historians we could explain how they work and how they came into being. So he's really drawing on some of the discussion that we talked about a couple of weeks ago of Castoriadis' article on worker councils and planning, and saying how can this be operationalized with computer technology that now exists, or that can be foreseen to exist, that goes well beyond the kind of algebraic or schematic presentation by Castoriadis, in which a new cybernetic communism, drawing on advanced supercomputing to algorithmically calculate labor time and resource requirements at global, regional, and local levels, or possible multiple paths of human development, and selection from these paths by layered democratic discussion conducted across assemblies that include socialized digital network and swarms of software agents, light speed updating, and constant revision of the selected plans by streams of big data from production and consumption sources. The passage of increasing numbers of goods and services into the realm of the free or of direct production as use values, once automation, copyleft, peer-to-peer commons, and other forms of micro-replication take hold. The informing of the entire process by parameters set from the simulations, sensors, and satellite systems measuring and monitoring the species' metabolic interchange with the planetary environment. That's quite a long sentence to parse and take apart and absorb, but basically he says it would indeed be a communism heir to Lenin's Soviets plus electricity, or Soviets plus a global cloud-based worldwide network in which information could be accessed in real time and funneled into planning systems, perhaps to the plan factories that Castoriadis foresaw. Now, he poses it as presenting an alternative modernity that neoliberalism is inherently unable to generate. And he cites Williams and Chernyshev's vision of accelerationism, counterposes that to the more social ecology, Murray Bookchin, decentralized, relatively non-technologically advanced notion of a socialism at human scale that some or many of us are actually more partisans of than the accelerationist, eco-modernist vision. But I do think he talks about ways in which technology could be leveraged even for such a less centralized, less top-down kind of planning process. And he cites Frederick Jameson's iconoclastic vision of Walmart as the shape of a utopian future looming through the mist, which is pretty hard to imagine, but I think he makes a case that Walmart is an entity whose colossal organizational powers model the planned processes necessary to raise global standards of living. This power rests on computers, networks, and information. By the mid-2000s, Walmart's data centers were actively tracking over 680 million distinct products per week and over 20 million customer transactions per day, facilitated by a computer system second in capacity only to the Pentagon. Barcode scanners and point-of-sale computer systems identify each item sold and store this information and process it in order to enable Walmart's just-in-time distribution of goods to all of its warehouses and outlets. So again, considering how this kind of technology, which actually exists, could be repurposed and modified for the purposes of planning and distributing goods from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, or at least in the early stages from each according to their labor contribution, and from each according to their ability. And again, he says this draws on Castoriadis and imagines a plan with implementation in the hands of local councils, in which there may be several plans made available by the plan factories, and cites Raymond Williams' observation that there's nothing intrinsically authoritarian about planning, providing there is always more than one plan. Or again, perhaps more than one sphere or region or district of where different plans are put into effect, and people learn from each other across regions and social entities, and the best plans are kind of rising to the top or becoming implemented on a wider scale. But then the last section of this, I think, is particularly important for us at the contemporary moment, because he notes that global climate change and a host of interlinked ecological problems challenge all the positions we discussed at this point. And indeed, there may be a need for what, as Michael Lowy puts it, a more comprehensive social steering than mere workers' control, or even the negotiated reconciliation of worker and consumer interests. Rather, it will, the global environmental crisis and capitalist constraints on the ecosystem will require the discontinuation of certain industries, the reshaping of transportation methods, the implementation of solar communism, which is our comrade David Schwartzman's notion, and planning that takes into account the ecological costs of nominally clean digital technologies, which are becoming increasingly apparent. The demands of chip manufacture for fresh water and minerals, the necessity of large-scale extractive industries, the prodigious quantities of toxic e-waste, and the way in which making every home a fabrication lab, mini factory with 3D printers, and kind of the utopian notion that Peter Frase has put forward, that could only speed up planetary heat death. So, contrary to all idealistic notions of virtual worlds, cybernetics are themselves inextricably part of the very industrial system whose operations have to be placed under scrutiny in a new system of metabolic regulation that aims for both red and green plenty. And he cites Paul Edwards' wonderful book, A Vast Machine, that really goes through for us the way in which climate science itself is fully dependent upon and a product of vast gathering of data by satellites and monitors, and the centralization and processing of that data on supercomputers to present knowledge about climate change on a global scale. And that this is a model, again, another model or example of the way in which data analysis on a vast scale can be brought to meet the needs of a future cooperative commonwealth of working people. Okay, I'll stop there. I really just run through the digest that Richard prepared for us, and people can go back to the Dropbox, read the digest, and if you have the inclination of the time to read the entire long piece by Dyer Witheford. And again, Chapter 8 of Witheford's Cyber Marks is another text worth having a look at.
Any of our outside friends have something that they'd like to add to this conversation? No?
And I've been talking about my so the
One moment, we're going to get Harry back on the line here.
there's a tension which I think can be called out by the future historian group. One is the accelerationist vision is that the future form of socialism will use big computing, big data, AI, and will be to some extent more efficient than that. The way that Nick Strinek hope this happens is something like the election of Jeremy Corbyn in the United Kingdom. Socialists would be elected, and then the socialists would nationalize the industry, establish universal basic income, and then more efficiently distribute goods without capital. Now, I think that's, it's not a necessarily unattractive vision, but where I think it goes wrong is it assumes, first thing, we know what happens when left-wing governments get power, from Allende to Syriza to Demos. If you did have a left-wing government come into power through representative democracy and try to establish some new form of socialism, even if it did use high-tech methods, they would probably be overthrown or at least constrained by the market. So the global question of global revolution comes up. That's why I'm actually more sympathetic to, I think it's actually more realistic, even though the accelerations pretend to be more realistic, to the methods put forward by Bochen and Öcalan, and also the older forms of dual power. I think you can imagine, as the climate crisis gets worse, people take more and more power back into their local communities and into real face-to-face contact and political organization. But I think the problem with Bochen and Öcalan and a lot of the thinking is that the technology's moved a lot since the time of where Bochen did most things right. And Öcalan's been in jail, so no internet access. So this kind of imagining of how we could establish local networks of decentralized communes, or cooperatives, and then how these networks would communicate in a way that doesn't require massive centralized computing, but still lets them transfer goods, information from point A to point B. And if you have a commune in New York, you talk to that thesis, how do you get it? How do you get it to move electricity around? How do you transition from things like nuclear power and the current centralized energy grid to more decentralized energy production system? These require both, I think, a political and philosophical orientation towards technology put forward by Bochen and Öcalan and Mumford and many others. This has to be updated, hopefully by the future historians group, but also by other people, to take into account modern internet technologies, which came about mostly after most of this writing was done. So I think that's a really important task, and I hope more people do it. I was very excited when one of the original Bitcoin coders came back from Rojava got excited by Bochen. Hey, you just sit down in my house and read Ecology and Freedom, then your job as some of the coders would be how do you implement some of this stuff that Bochen's talking about philosophically. I would like to see more people like Richard and other people here interact with coders in a way that they're unlikely to come here. They don't know about it, but they do have public conferences. Probably the largest hacker conference in the United States, which is kind of left wing. It's called Hackers on Planet Earth. Very nice name, hope. And it's every year or two, I forget, in New York, it's not very far away, it's in Hopewell, Pennsylvania. So maybe people could do a presentation about your work there next year.
Wow.
When?
Don't say when.
Oh,
Yes.
it's this summer, so it'll be next,
So we'll if you have to work on it.
it'd be next summer, yeah, I think it'd be very good. We did have Richard intervene in Tunisia a while back, I think intervening the audience primarily left-wing computer hackers, which is very interesting.
Yes.
But you have some time to get ready for it, think through these scenarios. How do you explain blockchain? How do you explain council communism to people who've never heard of it? It's really hard.
I think we had Sam on the end there.
Yeah. Am I on?
Sam, take it away.
Okay, now, one thing you may, we have a feedback situation. Is it my problem?
Yes.
What do
We're
I
good
need
here.
to do?
I don't know.
speakers,
Turn down your speakers.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Speakers down. Is that good?
Yes,
It's been the same for us.
we're fine. We're fine here.
Okay. One thing you may wish to consider in your calculus of the internet is the Chinese reaction to the introduction of the internet into their country. The Chinese internet is channeled through about a dozen, what do they call them, bottlenecks, right? And this is done so that if the Chinese Communist Party discovers any great threat to their rule, they can merely shut down the internet by shutting down the bottlenecks. Do not be surprised that if in the era of increasing authoritarianism, more countries than China try to establish this bottleneck system, okay, in order to make the internet an impossibility should they decree it necessary. One thing you may wish to consider in your budding movement to establish internet communism will be to have a backup plan in case the internet does not serve your purposes. That is all.
I was going to say something, but you don't have to do that. Fine, very loud. One of the things that's actually interesting about what you just said and what's going on is, I'll give you an anecdote. My primary business is printing. A family business from 1915, printing. And many, many years ago now, we were sold and acquired by a very large public corporation that one of their first initiatives was to put computers on everybody's desk. And we had really not had computers on everybody's desk ever, and had a older staff for the most part, and it's an industry that, you know, obviously has digital elements, but in many respects is the quintessential analog industry. But the end result of it was when the computers went on everybody's desks, everybody's to some degree really sat there and was waiting for the computer to spring arms and legs and do the work, or tell them what to do. And one of the things that I'm hearing, and I think is being said, is, and it echoes what you just said, Sam, is that the internet is a tool, but we can't really rely on it to be the answer. I think Harry said something to that extent. And of course, it's very, very true. The fact of the matter is that the internet has brought more complications. It has brought some solutions. It has potential for more solutions. But the fact of the matter is a technology that was ballyhooed to offer more opportunities has actually been used to, you know, restrict opportunity. That actually the consolidation of power is quite serious with the internet. The ability to have even less people controlling everything from a much smaller group is there as well, that they can cover much larger areas while they're doing it. So I think that while it's interesting, my instinct is that as someone looking back at 2117, that we're going to discover that the internet was just part of it. That actually perhaps we need to slow it down, what's happening there, although that sounds alarmist, and B, begin to move away from it. Because almost everything that's been said here today, which by the way, for the most part is my sense of it, I mean, Fred just was talking about, which is absolutely true, is that, you know, the biggest growth in garbage is toxic cell phones and chargers and laptops and things that are flushing the environment down even faster. One of the biggest reasons that we're having a lot of the problems we're having environmentally is energy consumption is up at an all-time high. And in the meanwhile, again, as a bringer, is that our industries have been attacked and that people don't want anything on paper anymore. We'd all be better off with a milkman and the newspaper than we are with bottles, you know, plastic cartons and our internet giving us everything. Now, we're never going to be able to put that genie back in the bottle, and I'm not even suggesting that that's what we should do, but I do think that it's an interesting element that just got raised here at the back end. But I also think was very much part of all these presentations is this is not necessarily even, perhaps it's not even a tool that we want, that maybe this is actually something that is more of an obstacle. Amongst other things, I always feel like it's the Brave New World versus the 1984. This is that the internet has drowned everybody out. So that Noam Chomsky talks about it a lot, that the information is there, you just have to find it. And that once that becomes an effort, most people are not interested in that, which is, of course, the other great argument against a lot of progressive left theories is somehow it's against the grain of human nature that people just want to zone out and not be involved. There's too much effort in the things that we're talking about. They really don't want to be involved in these things. They really just want to plug in and sit down. So I think, as you say, this is great, incidentally, everybody. This is really interesting stuff. Is that the internet is, in my opinion, it can be a tool, it is a tool, but it's a real obstacle. And it's actually presenting things that are even more dramatic than anything that we've ever faced. Not the least of which is I think it's actually facilitating the fact that the environment's flushing down the toilet, that we're unable to stop it, that this whole business about fake news, which we didn't talk about very much today, but clearly creates an environment where you have large groups of dissenting opinions that are backing up with facts that are, you know, at least half-truths. By the way, I think a lot of left also run, you know, you live in a world now where people get their news from Bill Maher or they get their news from Rush Limbaugh. And neither is an appropriate source for news. That's your internet.
Well, I have a question.
Go ahead, Richard.
It's really for the floor. When we talk about control or lack of control, the actual internet, the actual pathway for the information, should we be concerned that the devices we use to actually engage the internet are made by a handful of people? And that the operating systems that run those devices are limited? I mean, for the vast majority, it's either Mac OS, it's either Windows or Android. And so in thinking about all of this and thinking about future historians, my first thought was in order to really sort of set that decentralized information, it seems like given, and I'm not normally a conspiracy theorist, but the government's ability to tap into virtually any device we have, how do we, like, is there anyone out there making sort of an operating system that cannot be always, you know, accessed and taken? When you were speaking of Syria, I was just sitting there going, yeah, you know, holy shit, how do you control freedom of speech without knowing that everybody can be listening?
And on top of that, the U.S. government colluded with Microsoft, perhaps, is also frightening.
No, definitely not.
So fair enough.
I went to a flip phone 6 months ago just because I was just kind of sick of having that access all the time, and I needed a break from it. But I think it's a real question: is what do we do with the actual devices?
I've got two. So I think so just to back up to the original question, what's the backup plan for the internet? So in China, when there were the protests in Hong Kong, these umbrella protests, they understood that the internet might be cut. So they had a backup application called FireChat, which was like the internet but offered over Bluetooth, so it was very local. It couldn't be shut down. Shut down the internet. Now Bluetooth is maybe FireChat was kind of insecure, so a lot of activists, programmers, the UK person called Briar, B-R-I-A-R, which has the same functionality but is encrypted. Now, there hasn't been a second Hong Kong protest, but you could imagine that even if the internet itself goes down, it's controlled, or heavily censored, you can use a lot of these technologies to communicate more directly, particularly with the local environment. So, for example, I can send a Briar message from here to all the way down the street, and it never actually goes on the internet and such. That's nice. Let's do a telephone. So it's direct.
It's like a two-way radio or a one-to-many radio?
It's like a two-way radio. A two-way radio using, you know, instant pictures and messages. That's kind of useful.
Like,
the other, I would like to go back to fake news. Unfortunately, I don't have much to say about fake news. I think it's a really hard problem. It's one that requires a lot of new thinking, new kinds of things. I can only explain the reason why fake news happens because capitalism produces technologies which are optimized for advertising, and people click on things with short attention spans, and they're not optimized for fact checking. So, for example, I'm going to be talking at Google Tuesday here, and one of the other people talking is people who used to work for Al Jazeera, who got tired of all the fake news, and now building a data fact checking program. So I think all these programs can be created. It's just they weren't, capitalism was not incentivized to create them. In terms of the internet as an obstacle, I think a lot of that is true. Again, I think it's more of a terrain of struggle. Because you have to fight, and you lose, and you win, and you win a few, and you lose a few, and it goes back and forth. But in terms of like what people can do today, your question, I mean, it's a really simple point. First thing is don't use Microsoft products at all costs. I mean, they're also a bit equal, but to be honest, Apple products are typically much more secure. So you have, they're more expensive. You have an iPhone, use Apple Messenger. You're in a much better situation than you have in Android. If you have a Mac, your Windows system, you have Windows. Now, it's even better to run Linux, and it's even better to use an encrypted app made by anarchists called Signal, S-I-G-N-A-L. These have even better encryption and better technology. But, you know, they're also harder to use. So the Signal at this point is pretty easy to use and works on Android. I think there's these technologies, to our knowledge, even after the NSA revelation, the Apple case, are not entirely compromised. I don't want people to be very doom and gloom around surveillance. The situation they have today in 2017 is magnitudes better in terms of anti-surveillance technologies than a situation facing Syrian revolutionaries in 2011. Where we're worse off, is exactly, I'd like to hear more from you, is we're worse off in terms of government propaganda. This has actually increased. In 2011, the government was kind of caught by surprise. Now they're putting tons of money into propaganda, brainwashing. I also like to know historically, people like Richard studied revolutionary history, the Bolshevik secret treaty thing is really interesting. How is it that, and this is probably the most important thing that this group has to explain to computer hackers, how is it that the revolutionary social movements in the past, through Stalin, through the United States of the Red Scare, through all this other, how did they deal with the propaganda? How did they deal with this? Because I think the fundamental phenomenon is the same, it's just amplified by the internet. So how, I think that's something that I don't know as much about, and I'm sure most hackers, most computer programmers know very little.
Can I have the microphone?
Richard, could you say something about Victor Serge and clandestinity?
Oh, yes. Victor Serge wrote a little book in the 20s about, he was put in charge when the Bolsheviks took over of the Tsarist secret police archives. And he spent quite a time in there looking through and seeing how many double agents there were in the Bolshevik Party and in all the other opposition parties, to the extent that the spokesman for Lenin in the Duma, the kind of pseudo-parliament that the Tsar allowed Russia to have, Malinowski, he was a double agent. And what Victor Surge concludes is this, that Lenin's voice could legally be heard because the speeches that Malinowski made based on the party line of Lenin were recorded in the minutes of the Duma and therefore were free to be published in newspapers. And so the point is, it was Lenin's voice, it was the voice of revolution, even though it came out of the mouth of a double agent. And so we shouldn't be hysterical. We must assume, as I have on page 78, since I was 18, I've always assumed that my phone calls were likely to be tapped, because I grew up in the period of McCarthyism, and among people, my parents' friends, who were being sent to jail or losing their jobs or what have you, and the persecution was very real. It wasn't horrible like it was in totalitarian countries, but it was there. And don't get hysterical about it. I had a young recruit to my organization, who, I guess it was 58 or so, and he liked to play games with the FBI by setting up meetings under a bridge with somebody else. And we soon lost him because he was hysterical. And the FBI knew that he was hysterical. They came to his boss's office and investigated him. And of course, you know, it's a tip-off when they come, you know, do you know if he has any communist friends or whatever? It's very, very clear that their investigation was not to find anything out, but to get the guy fired. And but he didn't get fired, and I knew the reason why. His boss happened to be on our mailing list.
Yeah, right.
And was a sympathizer of our organization, and occasionally gave a little money. So, you know, let's not keep our eyes on the prize. Now, I would like to shift gears to the second part of our meeting today, which was, yes, I know, we're going to curtail it, but I still want to present what we were supposed to do. It was supposed to be another attempt at a creative writing, collective writing exercise taking place right here. So just, we'll maybe do it for 5 minutes, but I need to bring a number of points up for everybody. Last week we had some very, very interesting dissent in the group of negativity on the part of people who were resistant to the exercise that we were proposing the last time. And it made me rethink the whole project. Not only to, we had already thought of opening on the wiki discussion section and a blank page for people that didn't feel comfortable doing it in the group session. But the idea of negativity, which Peter Hudis always talks about, which Jason talked about in quoting Hegel of the suffering and of the negative, we need to embrace it. And that's what I saw. What I saw was that what I've written so far, that I put on the wiki as a kind of, let's say, paint by the, not so much paint by the dots, but as an outline for a group mural that other people would elaborate on, that it did seem frighteningly optimistic and Pollyanna-ish to a number of people. And that indeed I have not embraced the negative, so I rethought the idea. And my first thought was, of course, in the process of imagining, of writing the history, we have to take all that negativity in. So the people who felt resistance and didn't want to go along with the program, in fact, have a wonderful opportunity to express themselves. All of the fears that we have, for example, about the internet, all of the negative sides of this needs to be put in the past tense and placed into our future history under how, okay? Well, first of all, under that, but I think that I deserve credit for having put in as much of the negative in my presentation as I could, okay? So then we can accentuate that, and then the how, which Harry has presented as an actual war over the internet, where governments and corporations on the one hand, and people who believe in an open internet and in freeware and all these other positive, indeed, proto-communist ideas are on the other. Now, that's where the how comes in. In the next 30 years, this war is going to be fought out. And our job as future historians is to present a credible imaginary version of how that's going to happen, or how that could happen, okay? And dream up solutions. And that's now I want to get to the main point, which is what is my role here? And my role, I realize, is that of the dungeon master. I don't know how many of you people are familiar with the game Dungeons and Dragons, which is a $1 billion a year business and has hundreds of thousands of people playing, okay? Dungeons and Dragons is maybe over 20 years old, and it's a game that people play around a table, like here, okay? It's a game of adventures, and there is, the players are organized, convened, and that was the word that I chose for myself, my role here, convened to play this game, and the convener, the dungeon master, he sets the context in which the others form teams and play games, fighting dragons and what have you. But the point is that we have a context, and that's what I tried to do by setting up the wiki, as I did. And so, within this context, there are various struggles, and in the game Dungeons and Dragons, the different players earn points, and if they beat a monster and so on. Our game, the purpose of our game is to end up with a credible narrative in which there is still a livable world in 2117. So I'm not saying that that's going to happen. I need to confess to you my own doubts. I originally, back in '97, said it as if it's one chance in 100 for survival. And on bad days, I take that up to one chance in 1,000. So there's nobody here. I'm old enough to remember the milk being brought by a horse, okay? And various other things that I have great nostalgia for, and which I sincerely believe can and should be revived. The slow food movement, the local food movement, both here in the US and in France, is a real movement and is part of the whole emergence that we're talking about. So localization, yes, and artisanal things, we need to do away with all these energy consuming and world destroying technologies, okay? And certainly the internet, people forget it's not in the air, there is no cloud. There are huge servers that burn up a lot of energy and use horrible metals and so on. Of course, for purposes of sales and expansion of capital, they're constantly being replaced. And that doesn't need to happen. You know, the person, when I was still able to drive a car, I generally kept a car for 20 years. And there was no reason why not to. So, now, how do we play this game? All right, the game is very, very simple to play. We put on our future historians' hats, and I want everybody to have a hat next time, okay? And the rules of the game are very simple, okay? What we want to do is constantly add on, all right? So that we come up with problems and then with solutions, so that we can at least present a plausible, based not on gods or divine intervention or extraterrestrials, but on what we know and can be imagined. And so I've heard from just about everybody here, from Brian, from you, from myself, from Jason. What we're trying to find is how can the internet be configured differently? What kinds of platforms, what kinds of algorithms, what kinds of programs could exist? That is to say, not things that are out of the realm, but have not been developed by programmers, because most of them are working for the corporations and the governments, but not all of them. Anonymous isn't, although many of the people who, under the umbrella of Anonymous, attack these things, probably make their living. Of course, they're working for them. So the one thing that we need to do as a group is get our message across to people in the IT field. So we should accept the challenge that Harry poses. If you can get us into these conferences, we will appear. There's no doubt about it. Okay? Now, let's just try to do one thing wearing our hats. The rules of the game are very simple. Everything is either now, 2117, how we're living under red plenty, or then, and we've covered that a lot, but we can say more about the bad things in 2117, and the promising things. And finally, the how. And that is what I'd like to concentrate on today. So my challenge, and to do this, you have to use the past tense. You really have to imagine yourself in 2117. So I'd like everybody to just say one sentence or two sentences or something right now. And somebody will write it down, taking it off the tape that we're making, of something happening in that process, or something in the future that works, okay? Or a problem, and then the others can come forward with the solution. Let's just start with, I don't know what, I'll invent something right off the top of the head. In 2117, everybody was connected through local groups, met as 5 groups, and then discuss the major issues that are put forward by different parties, political parties, not as we understood them way back in the 20th century, as groups organized to seize state power, but parties conceived the way that Marx conceived it. That is to say, groups of people who have similar ideas and who create platforms in order to put them forward. And among the major parties today in our world of 2017 is the Production Party and the Degrowth Party. And each puts forward important arguments. The degrowth arguments you know about, and were already visible in the late 20th and early 21st century. To simplify life, to walk more lightly on the planet. Whereas the accelerationists that have suddenly come to the fore and also want to use massive technologies to overcome the effects of capitalist created global warming, and also, for example, to accelerate solarization by using the existing supplies of carbon in a crash program to cover the world with solar panels and geothermal and all the other wonderful substitutes that are renewable. So there's a vision of the future that I'm putting forward. And like everybody else, even if it's only one sentence, to imagine something, and if it takes place during the past, use the past tense. Who will be the first volunteer? Here we go.
So let's imagine that the software that Wayne and other people are working on in order to do better small group discussions and fact checking is bought by a big company. But rather than just giving it to the company, they open source it, make it free software, freely available. And that when there's another round of social protests, let's say 2020, 2011, or before that, 99, before that, 69, 70s, that various small groups, rather than be disorganized, are able to organize in small groups using the internet, but also face-to-face. This would be very effective in creating a network of small groups. Now, later, after capitalism starts, say, collapsing, after 2020, 2030 to 50, somewhere in this space, the collapse accelerates. And one of the problems that people have is that they don't really understand very well how their environment works. So, for example, the government starts collapsing, starts not taking care of the New York City metro system, starts basically scrapping it, just abandoning it. No more money, there's civil unrest. Sewage lines have to be maintained, sewage processing has to be done. Electricity needed to be maintained. But people don't know how it works. All that infrastructure is hidden. So people look, a lot of this infrastructure was considered stuff that would be valuable for terrorists to have, such information. So it was viewed as illegal. But what you see is as more and more companies fire their workers, you're seeing unemployed workers from the electricity sector, from the sewage sector, from the New York State Transit Authority. All these workers are getting fired, but they have the knowledge to run this stuff and they want to share it. And some of them may be part of groups, some of them may not be part of groups. But these groups also set up, similar to WikiLeaks, but not based on media, but based on local needs, ways for people to understand how things work. Even if it's illegal, even if those traders might lose their job and slight people, to be able to explain and give out diagrams and schematics and training and information about how their local environment works. And that helps these small groups when the government and various corporations stop maintaining infrastructure to help maintain it themselves.
Like in Puerto Rico today.
Well, yeah, Puerto Rico would be a good example. So.
I'm not, Harry can tell me if this even makes sense, but the same group developed the use of blockchain technology to have an open ledger for people that tracks in an open but decentralized judgment way, people that share, say, fake news or make consistently illogical arguments or make points that don't follow up on them, so they're not accountable for like the way social media works. You can just make something that sounds good, but then not actually defend the point, move on. But if there were actually, if public profiles, not so much of individuals, because there's a problem with powerful forces beneath, but people or groups that are projecting their voice, a way that's tied towards some kind of a public ledger that then tracks whether they have a record of doing these things, and then not censoring them, but just then you see, like, there could be a colored dot beside their name or something, showing that they have this record. You can, then how do you moderate that? I have no idea. That's why I don't know if it makes sense, but.
Okay. And actually, while a lot of this stuff is taking place, back in probably about 2017, 2018, smaller localities that already had a certain amount of food sourcing of their own and were much easier to demand consensus because they were much smaller, had begun to already push the envelope, as it were, in terms of control in their smaller areas. So that in the time of about 2030 to 2050, as Harry was just going through, where larger urban areas were truly beginning to collapse as infrastructure was not being supported by the various entities that do, a migration out of the cities began to happen. And the people did in fact begin to move back towards these smaller municipals that had already had some revolution and a certain amount of ability to control, better food sources, higher quality of life. And with the depopulation of our urban centers, a certain amount of environmental reversion of pollution, et cetera, began to take place, which enabled us to be enjoying a better environment in 2117.
Yay!
How's that? That's what you want, right?
Yay!
Exactly what you're looking for.
That the collapse of capitalism is helped along through these small communities by a collapse first of consumerism. And that the sort of addiction of spending and buying is replaced, at least spending and buying on large scale through large international conglomerates is replaced by spending and buying on and supporting on a local level. I think that the return to sort of a humanistic point of view in how we relate to each other by a reforming of social media, that social media doesn't take the place of our social interactions, but like the Arab Spring creates them. It's a heck.
So the debate that Richard was describing between the accelerationists and the locavores, shall we say, was really exemplified in particular after the secession of California in 2020. And as one of Governor Brown's last acts, he began to, he fell in with a group of accelerationists and began to try to turn California into a totally planned, fully automated luxury communist entity. And this actually had some success over several decades, and California began to attract some, further satellites, shall we say, in Nevada and Arizona. But at the same time, the people of Oregon and Washington began to develop along the lines that Dan was speaking of. And this was further complicated by the huge rise in a locavore movement in Latin America that really got its start, paradoxically enough, when a boatload of hackers landed in Puerto Rico in 2020 and gathered support and made their technologies available for local councils that began to spring up across the island in response to the total inaction and inadequacy of the rebuilding effort by the capitalists. And they finally got the people of Puerto Rico together to vote the capitalists off the island altogether and established a local and over time a thriving social order that became very attractive to the people of Venezuela, of Brazil, of the rest of Latin America. So that this ongoing debate and struggle to a certain extent between the rather centralized and highly technologically advanced systems of California and the west coast of the US, it's still to be determined whether, who's going to provide the best way of moving forward into the future. But we can perhaps imagine that that other zones of the world observing these developments begin to develop hybrids or synergies that try to pick and choose the best solutions of both.
As I recall my history, there was a reverse migration from New York to Puerto Rico, which under this localist movement had
You may need the
returned to using the beautiful fertility of that island to produce tomatoes and every other kind of wonderful thing to eat, and fresh fish out of the waters that surrounded Puerto Rico. It's time for somebody from the internet You have to put on your own hats. Alexi, are you the one that's remaining there?
We've lost everyone but Alexi.
Alexi, give us a picture of the future.
Unmute. There we go.
I have problems with hearing you because I got only a small portion of what you said. I think you have to fix this technically. Very difficult to understand what you're talking about, actually. Except Fred. People probably have to put a microphone closer to mouth or I don't know what.
So I think Richard is just asking you to imagine what would happen in the future with the development of technology and a transition to a communist.
Actually, I would prefer to present my vision of the future next time more extensively, because I have already some ideas. And my suggestion is that we presentations of most people present about the basic subject of our forum, conceptions of what happened over the 100 years from 2017 to 2117. We can, in the context of the general conceptions and general pictures, discuss such partial topics like internet and so on. I think that this would be more logical, actually.
Yeah. We'll take that into consideration. Okay, it's time to wrap up, but before we do, we need to look forward to next week and the week after. So next week is the 21st of October. The topic that we're going to concentrate on is catastrophes. The threat of atomic war, the threat of global warming, and going completely crazy, and all of the social problems and so on. So what we've sort of failed to do is create the reading list in time for people to read. In fact, we were just adding new things for today's discussion this very morning. So Fred has agreed to be the lead of the team that's going to set up the readings, and I hope that everyone will do as I tried to do, which is make digests of the articles, whether they're your own or the ones that you suggested, so that they're boiled down to a few pages that we can reasonably expect people to read. So we'll have that out by Tuesday at the latest. I want to look forward to the 29th. I would like volunteers for, I'll be one of them, to create a reading list and an agenda for the capitalism.
We're off. The syllabus is a little off. It's we'll fix that later.
Okay.
But
well, in any case, that is going to be the topic.
Capitalism's non-viability is for the 29th.
The non-viability
Right.
of the capitalism. To read the my version of the satirical take on capitalism called Billions versus Billionaires, which I've organized in terms of a typical kids' war game. Not kids, because adult kids play it too. And so what we want to do is elaborate on that game and use the good curious that we're learning from to the rich. So thank you everybody for your continued patience, and I thought this was a wonderful go-around. I was really thrilled at all the ideas. Now, we should be doing that all the time. Every time you have such an idea, like when you're reading, just write down 3 sentences and stick it onto that wiki where you think it's appropriate. Put in your name and either then, now, or how as the topic, and we'll take it from there. Thank you, and bye-bye to next week. All right.
or